Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to talk with you a little bit about the structure of 5.1 to 11.26. Now, this is a large block of material to try to work through with a survey, and it has its own particular challenges simply because we don't have a consistent flowing narrative, though there are some rhetorical features that hopefully you're able to pick up on. Now, as we go forward in this particular class, we're going to be working with some large blocks. And remember, you can apply Inductive Bible Study survey methodology to a unit of any size, including a whole book. So we will be doing book surveys later this term on Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which are all large books. We're also working on the Abrahamic account, which is 11.27 through most of chapter 25. Now, back to 5.1 to 11.26. Let's talk a little bit about some of the more, the clearer pieces that you can use to make sense of this particular passage. So, for example, if you look at the way the text unfolds, we have toledoth formula. These are the generations. This is the Hebrew word for generations. We have these at 5.1. We have the second one shows up at 6.8. Then we have another one at 10.1. And then we have the final one at 11.10. So we have these various generations which essentially trace out the spread of humanity from Adam all the way until a generation that captures, a genealogy that captures Abraham's father in 11.26. And we see the first mention of Abram at the very end of this in 11.26. So notice that essentially this moves from Adam to Abram. In the next toledoth are going to be the generations of Terah, the father of Abram, and that's going to capture all of the Abram materials. So this is a significant block of material. Now, a couple of the other things that we can look at here that can help us is we want to note the presence of genealogies, right? And so we have a genealogy right here. Then we have a second genealogy which runs essentially from chapter 10.1 all the way through chapter 10, which is 10.1 to 32. So we have a genealogy here. And then the last genealogy that we have is in this section. And so basically, note that this text begins and ends with a genealogy. So genealogies frame out the account, and then we have embedded in these some narratives. So essentially we have a framework of genealogies with toledoth statements that then have narrative that are embedded inside of these things. And so what narratives are we talking about? Well, here again, chapter 5, the whole thing is a genealogy. So we have the first few verses of chapter 6. These are those stories of the prelude to the flood materials, and verses 6.1 to 8 is the corruption of humanity. These clearly indicate that. Now, this goes right into the next narrative. Again, we have a toledoth here. So this is going to be Noah's flood. This is a large block of narrative that goes from 6.9 all the way through chapter 9. It's chapter 6, verse 9, all the way through chapter 9. So this goes from 6.9 all the way through 9.29. And so we have the flood, which is essentially 6.9 through chapter 9:17, and then we have the aftermath of the flood, which tells a very strange story about Noah and his sons that runs from 9:18 to 9:29. So we have this little middle section here. Then we get another genealogy which shows how essentially the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, how their kids go out and spread into the whole earth. So we have a genealogy followed by the last narrative, which is the Tower of Babel. So this genealogy is connected to the Tower of Babel. This particular genealogy is connected to the corruption, which leaves essentially Noah's flood in the middle of all of this. So when we're looking at some structures here, just notice that framing out the narrative helps quite a bit. And so essentially what we have, if we have some simple recurrences, well, first of all, we want to note that we have 4 toledoth statements, right? And so one major structure is going to be a recurrence of particularization, which has everything to do with the toledoth statements. Now, there's a broader particularization that takes place here that you probably noticed. We could essentially draw from Adam something like this. Because essentially 5:1 picks it up with, this is the line of the descendants of Adam, right? So in a sense, we can draw out a broader type of particularization with the general statement essentially capturing this flow that goes from Adam to humanity filling the earth, and then one particular person, Abram. So we essentially go from Adam to full earth. In other words, those creational intentions of God are fulfilled by the time we get to the end of the narrative, that we have essentially the picture that was present in Genesis 1 and 2. Humanity has fulfilled its vocation. It started small, and it goes and reaches its climax by achieving the fulfillment, which is what's captured in this section here, of persons who've been created in the image of God filling the whole earth, right? And so we see that in these genealogies. Now, let me get a little different color in here. We obviously also have a recurrence of genealogy. And you could potentially even argue that what we have here is some type of chiasm, where we have essentially narrative embedded around genealogy. So we might want to actually note that and look at some of the other pieces here. So perhaps this is even a chiastic structure, where we have genealogy, narrative, genealogy, narrative, and genealogy. And I would argue that the chiasm actually supports several of these structures. It certainly supports this broader particularization, and it also supports this particularization. So you might want to connect this particular chiasm with either one of these, either one of these. And you also want to see climax in the story probably here at the end of the Tower of Babel. In a sense, this little section here is more like the aftermath, where we see what God's solution is going to be hinted at. But essentially the climax, humanity has filled the earth. As the kind of the high point, which is Babel. And you can see that in two ways. It's both a positive and a negative climax, right? It's positive in the sense that humanity has fulfilled God's intentions. It's negative in the sense that humanity only fulfills God's intentions because God thwarts humanity's intentions. And instead of allowing humanity to build a tower to the sky and go beyond their God-given limits, God stops that and actually spreads them out and confuses their language. So they fill the earth, but there's broken community, right? So that just says the word brokenness there. So these are some of the things that you can see here. And let's talk about a couple of different pieces as well. There's also maybe a contrast of God's response to human sin, right? And so a big contrast that takes place in these units is what's Noah's flood. Noah's flood is God's response, and what takes place in Babel at the end. Another example of God's response. And so God responds in two different ways. One is a universal flood. One is filling the earth. Now, when we look at these two things, you want to look at a couple of different items, where some of the differences are. One of the differences is going to be in this whole issue of a universal flood. God does act justly in the sense that God responds to human sin and not simply being mean. If you watch the other video, I contrast what goes on in Noah's flood with what takes place in, say, the Babylonian account of the flood. It's radically different. But here again, we see two different responses. Now, in part, this is foreshadowed by the whole business of covenant, because we do get the first covenant, explicit covenant in Scripture, the Noahic covenant. You see this in chapter 9 in particular, where we get the whole business with the rainbow and such. But the end of the Noah's flood, we have God's response, which is going to be a covenant. And we essentially see that God no longer is going to destroy the earth. So the next time that humanity sins, they get this punishment is actually in fulfilling God's mission that sets things up for Abram. So these are some of the themes that flow around here. Again, sin continues to spread, but notice we continue to see aspects of God's mercies that are built in here. I'm going to leave it at that. I think that gives you enough structures. And again, some of you may have struggled with this, but what you want to do is you want to lay things out big picture and then drill down. Again, if you're looking for the main units, I would go with the main units here with these toledoth statements. I think those are the clearest pieces of structure. And then your subunits you can break up between, like here, between a genealogy and then the narrative about the corruption. The two big, the main unit here would be Noah's flood and the aftermath pieces. And you could drill down here a little bit more. In this third section runs from 10:1 through 11:9. Again, break it up between genealogy and Babel. And then we have this final genealogy, which you can break it up into a couple of pieces. Obviously, the last ones ends with the mention of who Abram is. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. Again, map out big chunks and then look for the things that can connect them. Again, within the book of Genesis, the toledoth statements can help quite a bit in laying these materials out. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. I'm Brian Russell. I will see you next time.